All right, let's get started. Ready for a deep dive into Europe?
Always up for a good deep dive.
Me too, especially when we have such a thought-provoking book as our guide. We're tackling Flashpoints, The Emerging Crisis in Europe by George Friedman. Have you read this one before?
Yeah, it's one of those books that really gets you thinking about the forces shaping the world.
Absolutely. I mean, just the title, Flashpoints, it suggests kind of a sense of urgency, doesn't it? Like, things are heating up.
Yeah, and he doesn't shy away from controversy either.
So let's dive in. What's the main argument, the big takeaway that Friedman's trying to get across in this book?
Well, he paints this really compelling picture of Europe, not just as a collection of countries, but as a living, breathing entity with a distinct character.
Okay, so like Europe has its own personality, its own baggage.
Exactly. And that personality, he argues, has been forged by centuries of conflict, cooperation, and cultural exchange.
I mean, Europe has seen it all, hasn't it? Empires rising and falling, wars, revolutions. It's a continent steeped in history.
And that history, Friedman argues, is crucial to understanding Europe's present and future. He's really big on this idea that you can't just look at what's happening today, you have to understand the historical context.
It's like those layers of an archaeological dig.
Perfect analogy. Each layer represents a different era, and they all contribute to the overall picture.
Okay, so understanding Europe's past is key. What else? What are some of the other big themes he explores in Flashpoints?
Well, one of the most fascinating arguments, and maybe a bit controversial, is that Europe's greatest strengths were also the seeds of its own destruction.
Wait, hold on. How can something be both a strength and a weakness? That sounds paradoxical.
It is, but that's what makes it so interesting. He talks about Europe's advancements in science and technology, its embrace of reason, the whole Enlightenment thing.
Yeah, Europe has always been at the forefront of intellectual and scientific progress. Think of the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, all those amazing breakthroughs.
Exactly. But those very same advancements, he argues, led to the development of incredibly destructive weapons technologies.
You're talking about World War I, right? That war was a game changer in terms of the sheer scale of death and destruction.
It was a horrifying turning point. Friedman argues that the quantity of death in World War I actually changed the quality of death. It became banal, almost routine.
It's hard to even fathom that. Millions of lives lost, entire generations wiped out.
And Friedman suggests that this mass death had a profound psychological impact on European society. It eroded the taboo against mass murder.
Like, it desensitized people to violence on a massive scale.
Right, the unthinkable became thinkable. And this shift, he argues, paved the way for even greater atrocities in the 20th century, like the rise of fascism and the horrors of World War II.
It's terrifying to think that progress, those advancements that were supposed to make life better, could also contribute to such darkness.
It's a sobering thought, and it really underscores the complexities of history. There's always this interplay of light and shadow.
So Europe experienced this incredible rise, but then a devastating fall. And in the aftermath of World War II, there was this desperate need to find a new way forward, right?
Absolutely. The continent was physically and emotionally exhausted, divided both geographically and ideologically.
And that's where this idea of European unity comes into play.
Right. Friedman talks about the role of the Marshall Plan, not only in rebuilding Europe, but also as a first step towards greater integration.
So the U.S. played a big part in pushing for a more unified Europe.
They did. The U.S., aiming to contain Soviet expansion, saw a strong, unified Europe as essential to their Cold War strategy.
It makes sense from a geopolitical standpoint. A united Europe would be a bulwark against Soviet influence.
Exactly. But of course, not all European nations were equally enthusiastic about the idea of relinquishing some of their autonomy.
Well, yeah, different countries have different priorities, different historical experiences. What were some of the main points of contention?
Well, for instance, Britain, still clinging to its victory, wasn't exactly thrilled about being on equal footing with defeated nations like Germany.
That classic British "we won the war" mentality, right?
Right. And then you had France, under de Gaulle, dreaming of leading a powerful European coalition independent of the U.S. They wanted Europe to have its own voice on the world stage.
Okay, so there were a lot of competing visions for what a unified Europe would look like. It must have been a messy process.
It was. But Friedman does a good job of walking us through the key steps, starting with the European coal and steel community, which focused on sharing resources for industry. Then came the Treaty of Rome, establishing the European Economic Community, laying the groundwork for a common market.
So baby steps at first,
Yeah.
leading to bigger leaps forward. And ultimately, it all culminated in the creation of the European Union through the Maastricht Treaty.
Right, and underpinning all of this was the promise of peace and prosperity. The idea that a unified Europe would prevent the horrors of the past from repeating themselves and create a zone of economic stability and growth.
It was a grand vision, wasn't it? A new era for Europe. But history has a way of throwing curveballs, doesn't it?
It does, and this is where things start to get really interesting.
The cracks in the foundation start to show.
Exactly. Events like the 2008 financial crisis and the Russo-Georgian War exposed the vulnerabilities of the EU, and the dream of lasting peace and prosperity began to crumble.
Sounds like we're heading into those flashpoints.
We are. Buckle up, because things are about to get intense.
All right, let's take a quick pause here and give our listeners a chance to process all of this.
Sounds good. We'll be back soon to dive deeper into the challenges and potential crises facing Europe.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into Europe. So we've laid out this idea of Europe as kind of a living, breathing entity shaped by its history. But I'm curious, what does Friedman have to say about Europe's relationship with the rest of the world? Specifically, with its big neighbor to the east, Russia.
Yeah, that's a big one. He spends a lot of time comparing and contrasting the European peninsula with Russia.
Okay, so like two different worlds colliding.
Exactly. You've got the peninsula densely populated, with this long history of shifting borders, constant competition for resources. He compares it to Russia, this sprawling giant rich in natural resources with a much lower population density.
So kind of a classic case of West meets East.
Right. And Friedman argues that this geographic and historical divide has shaped centuries of conflict and uneasy coexistence.
Okay, so where do those worlds collide? What are some of the specific areas where these tensions play out?
He talks a lot about these borderlands zones where different cultures, empires, and ideologies have clashed for centuries.
Ah, like those fault lines where earthquakes happen.
Exactly. And one of the most volatile borderlands, according to Friedman, is Moldova. This tiny country sandwiched between Romania and Ukraine, constantly caught in this tug of war between Russia and Europe.
You know, I remember he tells this funny story about crossing the border from Romania into Moldova and encountering these border guards who were obsessed with peanuts.
Oh, yeah. It's so random, but it perfectly illustrates that even the most mundane interactions in these borderlands can be infused with this weird tension, this sense of history.
Like, you never know what's going to happen.
Right. And then you have the Balkans, a region that's seen more than its fair share of conflict. Friedman talks about this sense of resigned acceptance among the people he met in Sarajevo, like they've just given up on the idea of lasting peace.
Yeah, I can imagine. After centuries of fighting, it's hard to stay optimistic.
It is. And further east, you have the Caucasus region, another historical flashpoint where empires have clashed for centuries.
So, not exactly a peaceful neighborhood.
Not exactly. Friedman points out that the Caucasus is surrounded by three major powers, Turkey, Iran, and Russia, each with its own agenda and vying for control.
So it's like a three-way chess match with the Caucasus as the board.
That's a great way to put it. And he talks about the strategic significance of those high Caucasus mountains. They've historically served as a natural barrier between Russia and the powers to the south.
So control of those mountains is key for Russia.
Crucial for their security, yeah. Which explains why they're so determined to maintain their influence in places like Chechnya and Dagestan, even in the face of fierce resistance.
Right. And let's not forget about the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Yeah.
It feels like that could erupt at any moment.
Exactly. That simmering tension, always there, bubbling under the surface. And the involvement of external powers like Turkey and Russia, it just complicates things even further.
So basically, a lot of potential for things to go wrong in that region.
Definitely a lot of moving pieces.
Okay, so we've talked about Russia's influence in these borderlands. But, you know, it's not just Russia that's asserting itself on the world stage. Friedman draws some interesting parallels between Germany and Japan.
Oh, yeah. He's got this whole thing about late bloomers, countries that came to global power relatively late in the game.
And he puts Germany and Japan in that category.
He does. They both underwent late unification, rapid industrialization. They both experienced those devastating defeats in World War II, and then, remarkably, rebounded to become economic powerhouses.
It's like they had something to prove.
Right. He argues that this shared experience, this late entry into global power politics, has shaped their approach to national identity and foreign affairs.
But their militaristic pasts, I imagine those are still hanging over them.
They do cast a long shadow. And he questions whether they can truly be economic giants without also becoming military powers again.
So it's kind of this balancing act. trying to assert themselves but not tip the scales too far in the direction of militarism.
Exactly. It's like they're trying to navigate this new world order, and it's not always clear what their role should be.
So where does that leave Germany in relation to the rest of Europe?
Well, he sees Germany as, in many ways, the economic engine of the EU. But he also warns about the potential for Germany to repeat its past mistakes. He's particularly concerned about this re-emerging narrative of German victimhood. They see themselves as unfairly burdened by their European partners.
It's like that sense of resentment bubbling up again.
Yeah. And that resentment, he argues, could destabilize the entire European project.
Okay, so Germany is a bit of a wild card then. Powerful, but with the potential to cause problems.
Yeah, I'd say that's a fair assessment.
All right, so we've talked about Germany.
Yeah.
What about France? What's their role in all of this?
Friedman sees France as kind of torn between Germany and the Mediterranean.
Torn. What do you mean?
Well, they've got this close relationship with Germany, but they also have these strong ties to the Mediterranean world.
Historically, France has always been a major player in the Mediterranean.
Exactly. And he talks about how France is trying to balance these competing interests. They want to be a leader in Europe, but they also want to maintain their influence in the Mediterranean.
Which is a challenge, given all the instability we've talked about in that region.
It is. And then you throw in the rise of right-wing nationalist parties across Europe, it just adds another layer of complexity.
Right. Those parties are often hostile to the EU and want to pull back from that integration.
Exactly. So you've got all these different forces pulling Europe in different directions.
It's like a tug of war, isn't it? With the future of Europe hanging in the balance.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Okay, before we wrap up this part, let's talk about one more key player. Great Britain.
Ah, yes, the island nation. Always a bit of an outlier, aren't they?
They are. Friedman talks about the English Channel as both a barrier and a bridge between Britain and the continent.
It's so true. It's like they're close enough to be involved, but far enough away to feel separate.
And that ambivalence is really evident in their whole Brexit saga, right?
Totally. He points out that Britain's historical strategy has been to balance power on the continent, preventing any single nation from becoming too dominant. But that strategy has often backfired.
Leading them into wars they might have otherwise avoided.
Exactly. And then, of course, you have the loss of their empire, which led them to try to balance power between Europe and the U.S.
So, always trying to play that balancing act.
It seems to be in their DNA.
Okay. This is a lot to digest. I think we need to pause here and give our listeners a chance to catch their breath.
Good idea. We'll be back soon to explore what all of this means for the future of Europe.
Welcome back to our deep dive. So we've explored all these flashpoints, these potential crises brewing in Europe, but where does it all lead? What does Friedman say about the future?
Well, he's not in the business of predictions, but he does lay out some possible scenarios, some different paths that Europe could take. He makes this point that Europe is facing a fundamental choice: integration or fragmentation. Stick together or drift apart.
And which way do you think the scales are tipping?
It's hard to say. There are so many factors at play. Friedman highlights a few big ones, though. The economic situation, the actions of major players like Russia and Germany, and of course the EU's ability to adapt and evolve, keep up with the times.
Okay, let's start with the economic side of things. We talked about the 2008 financial crisis, how it shook the EU. Are those economic anxieties still lingering?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The Eurozone is still struggling with slow growth, high unemployment, and some countries are drowning in debt. It's like this underlying sense of unease that just won't go away.
And I imagine that economic uncertainty feeds into political instability, right? Which is where those nationalist movements come in.
Exactly. It's this vicious cycle. Economic hardship fuels political extremism, which makes it even harder to address the root causes of the economic problems.
It's like a downward spiral.
It could be. If things keep going in that direction, it's not hard to imagine a scenario where the EU starts to unravel, countries retreat into their shells, focus on national interests, maybe even abandon the euro.
Wow, that would be a huge setback for the European project, wouldn't it?
Yeah, a fragmented Europe is likely a weaker Europe, more vulnerable to external pressures and internal divisions.
And what about Russia? They've been pretty assertive lately, especially with what's happening in Ukraine. Does Friedman see them as a major threat to Europe's future?
He does. He sees Russia's actions as a direct challenge to the EU's security and stability. There are definitely some echoes of the Cold War in this current standoff.
But it's not a simple repeat of history, is it?
No, not at all. The world is a lot more complex now. Russia doesn't have the same ideological pull that the Soviet Union had, and the EU isn't as unified as NATO was back then.
So it's a more fluid situation, more unpredictable.
Absolutely, and that makes it even more dangerous. The potential for miscalculation or escalation is high on both sides.
Okay, we've talked about economic uncertainty and assertive Russia. What about the U.S.? Where do they fit into all of this?
That's another big question mark. Friedman argues that the U.S. is stepping back from its role as the guarantor of European security.
So, like, America's turning inward, focusing on its own problems.
Something like that. And this shift is creating a power vacuum that other players like Russia are eager to fill.
So Europe's on its own, having to fend for itself.
It's looking that way.
Yeah.
And is forcing European countries to rethink their defense policies. Can they rely on the U.S. like they have in the past, or do they need to beef up their own defenses, go it alone?
It's a tough choice, especially when many European countries are already struggling economically.
Yeah, it's a dilemma. But the reality is the world's getting more dangerous, more unpredictable, and Europe can't afford to just sit back and hope for the best.
So to recap, we've got economic worries, an assertive Russia, and a U.S. that's increasingly disengaged. Not exactly a rosy picture. Does Friedman offer any solutions, any way out of this mess?
Well, he doesn't pretend to have all the answers. His book is more about asking tough questions, prompting us to think critically. But he does suggest that Europe needs to rediscover its sense of purpose, its shared destiny.
You're talking about that idea of European exceptionalism, that belief in Europe's unique role in the world.
Exactly. But he thinks Europe needs a new form of exceptionalism, not based on military power or economic dominance, but on a shared commitment to those values that have made Europe so influential: peace, democracy, human rights.
A more enlightened kind of exceptionalism, one focused on building a better future, not just for Europe, but for the world.
That's the idea.
It's a hopeful vision, isn't it?
Yeah.
But how do we translate these big ideas into action? What can ordinary people do to make a difference?
That's the key question, right? And I think the most important thing is to stay informed and engaged. Don't just passively consume the news, question it, challenge it, seek out different perspectives.
Friedman's book is a great starting point, but it's just that, a starting point.
We need to keep asking questions, and then take that knowledge and put it into action. Get involved in your community, advocate for the causes you believe in, make your voice heard.
So it's not just about understanding the world, it's about shaping it.
Exactly. The choices we make individually and collectively, they have ripple effects. We can choose to be part of the solution to build a better future for ourselves and for generations to come.
That's a powerful message to end on. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Flashpoints. It's been a fascinating journey.
It has.
We've explored the forces that have shaped Europe, the challenges it faces, and the potential paths that lie ahead. But ultimately, the future is not predetermined. It's up to us to decide what kind of world we want to create. So stay curious, stay engaged, and keep exploring.